I have worked in the vault of concluded species for 31 years, and in all that time I have never once had to invent a category. The vault sits beneath the Hall of Navigational Records, in the oldest substrata of the Conclave's archive complex on Thuresin Prime. Most archivists work the upper halls: species histories, trade route documentation, diplomatic correspondence going back 6,000 years of recorded interstellar contact. The upper halls are bright. They smell of active preservation resin and the mild electrical hum of indexed retrieval systems. Colleagues greet each other by name in those corridors. They eat together. They argue about methodology. I work below all of that. The vault of concluded species is climate-locked at a temperature slightly below comfort, which suits the work. The collections do not require warmth. What they require is precision, patience, and a particular kind of stillness that most archivists never develop. The ability to sit with an absence and treat it as data. Each concluded species occupies a sealed corridor of its own. The corridors are not labeled with dramatic language. They carry only the species designation, the date of last verified contact, and a single character classification code. I assigned all of those codes myself over many years using a taxonomy I developed and submitted to the Conclave Standards Committee, proved it without revision, because no one else on the committee wished to think about the taxonomy at all. Most classification codes indicate natural terminus, resource failure, ecological collapse, absorption into a larger civilization, simple silence. The slow kind that means a species chose to go inward, to stop broadcasting, to let the galaxy forget them. Those are the majority. The galaxy has a long memory for the spectacular, and a short one for the quiet, and most species end quietly. There is one code I use more carefully than the others. The code is a simple glyph, the third character in our notation system, and it means incursion into prohibited coordinate space, followed by cessation of all signal, with no verified survivor contact, and no debris recovery within 10 standard years of last known position. Do not write that out in full on the corridor placards. I use the glyph. It is sufficient. It was Vereth, my junior colleague, forced me to explain the taxonomy in full. He is young, not young enough to be foolish, but young enough to believe record with no explanation attached is an invitation to fill in the gap himself. He came to me with the Duresi file. The Duresi were a mid-tier spacefaring civilization, territorial, confident in their fleet capacity. They had, approximately 140 years, been expanding along the outer arm of their home cluster, at a rate that was, by any measure, impressive. They were not aggressive in the way that brings immediate coalition response. They were methodical, organized. They negotiated when it served them, and absorbed when it did not. Every species they encountered left the exchange diminished in territory and enriched in nothing. The Conclave's observation record on the Duresi runs to 41,000 indexed entries. Then it stops. Vereth stood at the corridor entrance, with the access tablet in his hands. The glyph lit on its screen, and he asked me what had happened to them. Told him to walk with me. We went down the corridor together. The Duresi collection is not large. Species that receive the glyph classification rarely leave substantial material behind. By definition, terminus event occurs outside their home system, in transit, and what remains is absence rather than artifact. What we have are the transmissions they sent before the silence. Navigation logs, fleet coordination signals, and at the very end of the file, a single encoded burst transmission that their rear echelon sent back to Duresi Prime, approximately 14 hours before all signal from the advance fleet ceased. I played the transmission for him, not because it is dramatic. It is not particularly. It is a fleet coordinator's voice, calm and professional, describing sensor contact with an object that did not match any cataloged vessel profile. The transmission ends mid-sentence, not with static, not with distress signaling, not with the kinds of sounds that might be expected from combat. It simply ends, the way a recording ends when the device stops, or when the device is no longer there. Vereth was quiet for a long moment after the transmission concluded. Then he asked the question they always ask. He asked why the Duresi had crossed into that coordinate space at all. I showed him the corridor adjacent to the Duresi files, the Vereth Sen, before the Duresi, and the corridor adjacent to that, the Chilori Compact, And the one before that holds a species so old that their name exists only in the phonetic transliteration. Another species recorded before that second species also received the glyph, 7 corridors, 7 glyphs, spanning 4,000 years of records. Verith walked the line of them slowly, reading the placard dates, doing the arithmetic in his head. I let him do it without interruption. The silence down here is useful. It lets the data settle. He turned to me and said, "Every one of these was a spacefaring civilization that moved against the same coordinate space." I said, "Yes," he said, "and none of them came back." I said, "The Conclave has one verified partial exception. A single courier vessel from the third civilization on this corridor reached the edge of charted space and transmitted a navigational warning before. Its drive system failed. The crew did not survive the transit back. What we recovered was the transmission itself. It's the Conclave incorporated into the navigational restriction notices that went to every registered spacefaring body at the time, and have been reissued periodically since. I have a copy in the reference archive if you wish to review it." He asked if the Doresi had received that notice. I said, "The Doresi received a version of it. Every civilization that is registered with the Conclave's Navigational Bureau in the last 3 years has received a version of it. The notice has been translated into 412 languages. It is explicit. The coordinate restrictions are not suggestions. They are accompanied by the full archive summary of prior incursion outcomes, formatted for whatever cognitive style the recipient civilization uses to process mortality data." He asked what the Doresi's response to the notice had been. I told him to look at the Doresi political correspondence file, cross-referenced under navigational policy, and he would find their formal response. He could read it himself. I had read it once. I found no value in reading it again. The content is what the content always is. A confident appraisal of their own fleet capacity, a theoretical reframing of the restriction as a legacy policy from a less technologically sophisticated era, formal declaration of their intent to conduct what they termed a navigational survey of the restricted coordinate band. Verith read it. He stood there for a long time. Then he asked me how I could do this work, how I could maintain these files, catalog these corridors, assign these glyphs, year after year, without it changing something fundamental in how I understood the galaxy. I told him it has changed something fundamental in how I understand the galaxy. I told him that I used to believe the most dangerous thing in any archive was an incomplete record, a gap in the data, a missing entry that might cause some future navigator to make a false assumption. I spent the first decade of my career obsessing over completeness, over closure, over filling every silence with verified information. I do not believe that anymore. The most complete record in this vault is the one that simply demonstrates a pattern and then stops talking. 7 corridors. 7 glyphs. Pattern does not require elaboration. The silence at the end of the 7th file is not a gap. It is the conclusion. The record is not incomplete. The record is finished. Any civilization that receives our navigational notice, reads the archive summary, chooses to reframe the data as an invitation rather than a warning. That civilization has already completed its entry. I am simply waiting for the date of last verified contact so I can fill in the placard. Verith asked if that was what I wrote in the Conclave's methodology report. I said no. In the methodology report, I wrote that the classification systems is designed to support navigational planning and historical analysis, and that the glyph designation carries no predictive claim about future incursion attempts. He asked if that was the truth. I looked at the 7 corridor placards for a moment. Then I told him it was accurate. It is not the same thing. I walked him out of the vault and locked it behind us, and I went back to my work. There will be an 8th corridor eventually. There always is. When it comes, I will assign it the glyph, seal the file, and update the navigational notice with the new date. The archive asks nothing more of me than that. It does not ask me to prevent what the record describes. It asks me only to keep the record clean. I keep the record clean.